So I had a topic all picked out to talk about today, and it's actually I've been working on preparing for that episode for weeks now, like walking around with this index card in my pocket and writing down notes of things that I wanted to say. But although it is an episode of Flashback, it doesn't really have anything to do with the original intent of this show, which was to sort of chronologically step through my video game history. And, I know that we did the Christmas episode, and then, I just did that pickups video last week, which admittedly is not part of the Flashback series. But what happened was, I have that PC down in the basement that I use for streaming and to a certain extent for recording gameplay footage. And it's the only PC that I have, because I have all these freaking Apple computers, which I'm really starting to sour on a little bit. But anyway, it just occurred to me that means that I can play PC games now. And I downloaded a few older PC games, and it really just got me excited to start talking about the subject of today's episode, which honestly is something that I've been waiting to talk about ever since I started this show, meaning Flashback. And, people often, it's probably one of the things I get asked, probably the two most common questions that I get asked are you from Finland? Because of, well, it's off camera for you guys, but you guys know what sign I'm talking about. And what's your favorite game console? And in fact, I even answered that question on a Q&A episode, right? And as I explained in that video, my three favorite consoles are the NES, the Genesis, and the PlayStation. And on any given day, my answer is going to be one of those three, but it won't be the same. And to illustrate the point, I don't actually remember which console I said was my favorite on that Q&A episode, just because, like I said, I really love them all equally. But if you were to ask me what my favorite gaming platform is, I honestly think that it's the DOS PC. And so like I said, I've been waiting to talk about this ever since I started Flashback. But before we get to that, we have one postcard, just because, I just recorded that pickups video, like a week ago. So we just have the one, and that comes from Alan in Arlington, Texas. And I may be wrong, but I don't think this is the first postcard we've gotten from Arlington, Texas. But for whatever it's worth, I believe it is the first postcard we've gotten from someone named Alan. So thank you, Alan. I didn't know Bluebell ice cream was from Texas, but that's pretty cool. And Alan, your postcard is already on the way back to you. And just because, we constantly have new subscribers coming on board, basically the deal is if you send a postcard into the show from wherever you are throughout the world, I will send you back a Classic Gaming Quarterly postcard, again, anywhere in the world. So the mailing address for the show is down in the description, the video description, and if I remember, I will put it right here. The first time I ever remember actually sitting down and interacting with a computer was the 4th grade. And I think that probably a lot of you will have a similar experience to what I'm about to say, which is that, in my 4th grade class, over in the corner of the room, we had a desk that had an Apple IIe sitting on it. And, Apple sold a lot of Apple II computers to schools. And, for sometimes it would just be one in the corner of a classroom, like what I'm talking about. Sometimes there would be a classroom full of Apple computers, Apple II computers, which was the case when I was in junior high. But, I don't know what dictated whether or not your classroom had a computer. Like my 3rd grade, this was all at the same school. My 3rd grade class didn't have a computer. My 5th grade class didn't have a computer. But in 4th grade, we had this Apple computer sitting in the corner of the room. And maybe it just came down to whether or not the teacher wanted to deal with it, or, because obviously somebody had to learn how to use it, and that was going to fall to the teacher. So, I don't know if that has anything to do with it. Mrs. Guthrie, that was my 4th grade teacher. But anyway, we had this Apple computer in there that we didn't really get to use very often, but, every once in a while, we would all take turns going over there and sitting down and playing some of these edutainment games that I briefly mentioned sort of at the beginning of the video that I did a long time ago, talking about Oregon Trail and Where in the World is Carmen Sandiego. There were all these edutainment games like Math Blasters and Word Munchers, Spellicopter. I mean, there were tons and tons of them. And I think the main place that most kids played those games was at school. Firstly, because most of us did not have computers at home at that time. But also, if we did, that's really not the kind of thing you wanted to play on your home computer. Like if you could play the original Castle Wolfenstein or something, or some Atari arcade port, or you could play Spellicopter, which one were you going to choose? But that was the first time I ever remember getting to actually sit down and just press the keyboard and play with a computer. And of course, none of us cared that those computers only had these edutainment titles for them, because we were getting to play a video game and getting to interact with a computer at school instead of doing whatever other boring thing we would otherwise be doing. Now, like I said, in 5th grade, we didn't have a computer, but I knew this kid. There was this kid that lived. So I lived on this weird street where the street wasn't that long, maybe an eighth of a mile, like very short. And both sides of the street had a T intersection. And I lived kind of close to the middle of the street. And this kid lived all the way at the end at the T intersection. Like he actually lived on the street going the other way. But like if I walked out to the end of my driveway and looked out, like I could see his house. And for the life of me, I cannot remember his name anymore, which is weird because for a long time I did remember his name. But I'm almost 42, so the brain cells are leaving quickly. But the few things I remember about that kid. First of all, he had a Mongoose bike, which right around this time is when I got my first bike. The big brands of bike back in the day were like GT, Diamondback, PK Ripper, Mongoose, and I'm probably forgetting some. But if you wanted like a cool kid's bike, those were like, any of those you'd be good to go, right? He had one of these Mongoose bikes. It wasn't even painted. It was like just, the whole thing was like chrome, and it just had like the Mongoose logo, I think probably going down the down tube. I don't remember, but, and it wasn't like tricked out, like it didn't have pegs or it didn't have a rotor, but it was just a cool, pretty standard BMX style bike. And I just thought that bike was so cool, and I really wanted one. And instead I got a Murray. It was a Murray, I don't know, 3000, 5000, I don't remember. I think I talked about that already. Got it at Kmart. That's how I found out Kmart wasn't cool. And but Murray was like Huffy. It was like a pretty standard. A lot of kids had Murrays and Huffies. But anyway, that's thing number one. Thing number two, I remember that his dad drove a Porsche, because like we would leave his house usually through the garage. Like we'd come in and go out through the garage, and I just remember walking out past that Porsche because I just remember looking at the hood ornament. I just remember seeing that cool logo and just being like, wow, a Porsche, and whatever. But the third thing I remember about that kid is that he had a Commodore 64 in his room. And he didn't have a disk drive for it. I think I've mentioned this before I don't remember the context, but I've mentioned this on the show. He had this Commodore 64 in his room, hooked up to, I don't know if he had a Commodore 1702 or if he just had a TV. And he didn't have a disk drive. Because if you remember back then, like the disk drive cost as much as the Commodore 64 itself, if not more. So I think a lot of kids ended up getting a Commodore 64 because you could get them at Toys R Us. And you could just buy cartridge games for it and play the system that way. Obviously, you were going to be missing out on a lot of games, and a lot of the better games, frankly, if you didn't have a disk drive. But even just having the computer itself and a joystick, there were tons of games that you could play. And the one game that I remember playing at his house was Choplifter, because that came out on disc, or on cartridge rather. But I don't know what kind of money his parents had or something. I'll say this for my dad. For as long as I was growing up, we always lived in rentals. Like he would always rent a house because we moved around a lot. But he always made sure that we had a house in a nice neighborhood. Not necessarily like rich people neighborhood, but very solidly middle class to upper middle class neighborhood. So I ended up palling around sometimes with kids like this who were, rolling around on a mongoose or riding around in their dad's Porsche, and having a Commodore 64, in their bedroom. And the other friend I know I've mentioned him before was Sean, my friend Sean. This was at the same time he lived in that same neighborhood. And, he moved away when I was in, fourth or fifth grade. I know I talked about that on a previous episode of Flashback. And I think I even mentioned the fact that he had an Apple II GS. Like while I was friends with him, like one day his mom brought home an Apple II GS. But the Apple II GS, when it came out, was really expensive. I mean, it was the top of the line Apple II computer. And they had the whole setup with the Apple RGB monitor and a couple of disk drives. And I remember I was insanely jealous when he got that, because I'd go over to his house and we'd sit on the floor. I remember that the computer was set up on like some kind of lower piece, like a low sideboard, or I don't know. I don't know the furniture lingo. I don't know what you call it, but I remember that we sat on the floor to play with the computer, and the two programs that I guess came with the computer, he had Shanghai, which, who didn't grow up playing some iteration of Shanghai, where you had the mahjong tiles that were kind of stacked up in sort of that pyramid, and you had to eliminate matching tiles. Anyway, he had Shanghai, and we used to play that quite a bit. And then he had some kind of painting program. I don't remember if it was Apple Paint or Deluxe Paint, or there were several of those programs running around back in the day. But it's like a predecessor to like Microsoft Paint. Like that was the first time I ever used a mouse or saw a mouse. And I just thought that was like the coolest thing. But, like I said, I don't know if his mom was a teacher or something, because that computer was I want to say upwards of $3,000 retail. But I know that that teachers got like an educational discount. So I don't, she was a single mom. So, I don't know. But and then I remember, after I moved back with my mom in sixth grade, we actually had two computers in the classroom, and one of them was a Commodore 64, and the other one was like an Apple II, probably an Apple IIe. It wasn't a GS, that's for sure. And I remember that was the first time that I ever saw somebody loading a game program off of a cassette tape. And there was this kid in my class named Darren, and Darren was like the class computer nerd. I think he had a computer at home. I want to say maybe his dad was somehow involved. Like maybe his dad was an electrical engineer or some kind of computer guy. Because Darren like knew a lot about how to use computers. And I just remember, sometimes after school I would stay, because my teacher would usually stay until 4:30 or something like that. And she would let any of us that wanted to hang out in her classroom. And just either, you could work on homework if you wanted to, like if you couldn't go home for whatever reason, or if you wanted to play around with the computers. And I remember sitting there with Darren, and he was trying to load a program off of the tape recorder, that little desktop tape recorder. And anybody that has ever done that before, that, if it's not a tape recorder that is, intended for use with a computer, like, Commodore had a tape drive that you could buy that didn't really have a lot of controls on it. It had like, play and rewind and fast forward, I guess. But if you bought one of those standard like Panasonic or Radio Shack tabletop tape recorders that was really meant for, audio use or for, taking, voice notes or whatever, sometimes you had to kind of play with it to get it to work. Like you had the volume knob, and then you also had the tone knob. And usually it was the tone knob that you had to set just right so that the computer could basically understand what the tape recorder was telling it. And I just remember that, he was sitting there playing with that. to get the thing to load, and finally he got it to load. I just remember thinking like, wow, this guy really knows what he's doing. Like, he knows about the tone knob. Sorry, my mouth is getting dry already. Who remembers these Tupperware cups? You know, this is like an old one from the 80s or whatever. Like, when I was a kid, I must have drank, over the course of my childhood, like 50 gallons of Kool-Aid out of a cup just like this. But anyway, I mean, so as much as I thought computers were cool, you know, as I've said before, that was not something that I ever saw as being something that was attainable for me. You know, like my dad didn't really have the money for stuff like that, and my mom especially didn't have the money for something like that. You know, like an Apple II GS for, you know, a few grand, like that's not going to happen. And so, you know, I didn't even waste time worrying about it. And then I don't really understand what happened, but in 8th grade, which isn't long after the time I'm talking about, I got a computer. And I've been sitting, like, trying to figure out, like, how that all went down and what happened, because I don't recall in junior high being especially interested in computers. Like, there was a computer class that you could take at my junior high, which really just taught you basic, you know, how to program in BASIC. And I remember Jonathan took it, but I didn't take it. And like, Jonathan didn't have a computer, and nobody else I hung out with at school had a computer. And so I don't recall being particularly amped up at the time to get a computer. All I remember is that, you know, it was sort of the first half of 8th grade, because it was sometime in like the late fall or winter. Somebody put an ad in the paper selling a computer, and my mom and I went down to this. It was like an office, just some kind of little, you know, business office or something in a little office complex. And whoever's office that was I guess selling their computer because they upgraded to something better. And you know, it was like, in my recollection, it was something like $250 or $300 for the whole system. And so we got it and brought it home. And like I said, I don't know if like my mom saw something on TV, like maybe there was like a news story on 60 Minutes about how kids need computers, or if she somehow knew this lady. Although, like I said, I remember the ad being in the paper, so I really don't know what happened all of a sudden. I don't remember that like suddenly I was begging for a computer. Although I'm sure if I called my mom and asked her, she would say, "Oh yeah, you were just begging for a computer," which I don't think is true. But anyway, we got this computer and brought it home. I had no idea how to use it, and so you might be wondering, well, what kind of computer was it? And well, I'll show you. So I don't have the computer anymore, of course, but a few years ago, I was in a thrift store and I found this, and I mostly bought this because I was actually going to send it to somebody else. So, I mean, what it is, it's a 1986 official Minnesota Twins scorecard, which they don't really sell these anymore. It's like, now if you want a scorecard, you either bring one or you have to buy the program for like $10. But this is pretty cool. So all it is, you know, it's on like cardstock, and it's just one page or whatever, if you want to call it that. You know, it's got whatever it's got on the front. Super America Travel Center. I don't know what that is, but anyway, you unfold it, and the whole middle of it is a scorecard. On the back is, of course, an ad for cigarettes. But the reason that I hung on to this and didn't send it to the person that I was going to send it to is that I saw this ad inside. And I'm going to try to hold it up as close as I can. You see that ad there is for an Epson Equity computer. And that's basically the exact computer that I had. It doesn't say it on here, but I can tell by the form factor that's actually an Epson Equity 2, just because the Epson Equity 1 looks totally different. And that's what I got. And so what we came home with was, you know, the computer itself, you know, the case, and it did come with a monitor, and it came with the keyboard, of course, and it came with a printer. And like I said, it was about 250, 300 bucks. And the Epson Equity 2 used an NEC V30 processor, which is just an NEC clone of an 8086. So like, you have, 486, 386, 286. Was there a 186? I don't know. But this was an 8086. So it's a XT class system. It had 2 disk drives in it, which is nice because I think the stock computer only came with 1. But it had 2 double density 5.25-inch disk drives. And the monitor was monochrome. It was green monochrome. Now, maybe I'm missing one, but back in the day, the only 3 I remember, there was the green monochrome, there was white monochrome, like early Macintosh computers, and then there was the amber monochrome. But anyway, mine was green, so it could do Hercules graphics, and it was called Hercules graphics. It didn't come with a mouse, which is fine. It didn't come with a program that would use the mouse. So this lady, she had the whole setup, she gave it to me, and then I got the 2 books that originally came with the system, which were like, they're like, I guess they were 3-ring binders, but they were like smaller. Like it wasn't a standard 8.5 by 11 binder. It was like some smaller, day planner looking binder, but much thicker. And that also had the software that originally came with the computer. So it came with 3 floppy disks. It came with DOS. It came with Lotus 123, which for anybody that doesn't know is like a predecessor to Microsoft Excel. It's a spreadsheet program. And it came with GW Basic, which I don't know what GW stands for, what GW Basic is. It was just basic, like programming language. And that was the only 3 disks that it came with. And I had never in my life used a PC. So I had no idea what to do. I think, I just had to get the manual out. And okay, you got to put the MS-DOS disk in there and fire it up. And okay, well, see what happens. But it didn't even come with like a text editor. So, I even remember the first night that I got it. So I didn't have a desk in my room. So what I had the computer set up on was a milk crate, which is funny because I actually still have that exact same milk crate, just because I use it for, storing stuff. But so I had the computer, or I had the milk crate rather, turned upside down, sitting on the carpet, and the computer, it was a desktop style case, right? So it was it was in landscape mode, not portrait mode. So that was sitting on top of the milk crate, and then the monitor was sitting on top of the computer, and then the keyboard was just on the floor. So you would just sit on the floor and either put the keyboard in your lap or just have the keyboard on the floor, and you were just go to town, do whatever. But anyway, that first night, I just remember sitting there, my stepdad and I sitting on the floor, writing like a story on Lotus 123 because I didn't have a text editor, and I didn't know, nor did he, what a spreadsheet program was. Like you start the program, and there's all these little boxes, and I'm like, I don't know what this is for, but it was the only thing that we had where you could seemingly enter text and have it stay there. So that's what we did. We sat there and we were like, writing out some kind of little stupid story. And I just remember that from the night that I got my computer. But other than that, I really didn't know what to do with it. And so the next day, I went to school. For PE, you'd go in the locker room and change, or we used to call it dressing out. I don't know what that means. Like, oh, you gotta go dress out. I don't know. But you go in there, you change any of your gym clothes, and then we would come out of the locker room. You would go line up in alphabetical order along this chain link fence. And then, whatever time, 10 past when the bell rang or whatever, to give everybody a chance to dress out, your PE coach would come out and take roll by just walking down the line, before too long, he knew who everybody was, right? So he would just walk down the line with a clipboard in his hand and just, check you off if you were there. As long as it didn't take you forever to dress out, that was usually a time where you could kind of BS with your friends or classmates for a few minutes, because you'd get your shorts and your t-shirt on, and then you'd go out there, and while you were waiting for the coach to come by and check you in or whatever, we'd kind of sit there and talk to each other or whatever. And I remember that I was telling somebody about how I had just gotten a computer. Like, yeah, I just got this computer last night, and whatever I was saying about it. Probably saying I had no idea how to use it. I don't really know. But this kid overheard me, this kid Stuart, and he came over. I was like, oh, I heard you, I just overheard you say you got a computer. And it's funny because I didn't really know Stuart, but, we had gone to the same elementary school, and then now we were going to the same junior high. So it's not like, you know how it is? Like, it's not like I didn't know who he was, but it's like, you've been going to the same school with the same kids long enough that you kind of know everybody's name, but they're not your friends, right? But he overheard me, and so I kind of knew who he was. Like, oh, hey, you're Stuart, right? Yeah. And so he said, oh, hey, I have a computer at home too. And he, was like, oh, you don't really know how to use your computer. And I said, no, And he's like, well, you should come over to my house and I'll show you some stuff or whatever. And I was like, oh, well, that would be awesome because, I was totally lost. So, so that day after school, I go over to Stuart's house. And, I already said the two most common things I get asked, right? Favorite game console, am I from Finland? The third one is Jonathan related. Like, what happened to Jonathan? Why aren't you friends with Jonathan anymore? Can we get Jonathan on the show, et cetera, et cetera? And the boring truth of it is that Jonathan and I just drifted apart. Jonathan kind of went on and became sort of one of the cool kids. I like to say that phrase a lot, the cool kids. That was sort of like the in crowd. And so, he and I just kind of drifted apart. And I think part of what helped move that along was me getting this computer and then becoming friends with this kid, Stuart. Because basically what happens is that Stuart became like my new best friend. And, he and I were like inseparable instead of Jonathan and I. But so I go over to Stuart's house after school, probably that day. Their house had like a living room that nobody ever used. And then there was like a little family room with a TV. That's where everybody hung out. I had the same thing in my house. Like, in fact, my grandma didn't even want me going in the living room at my house because that was like for, when company comes over. But whatever. But so in their living room, which, like I said, nobody ever used, was a big like old wooden desk. And on the desk was Stuart's computer. So Stuart, well, I guess I did too, right? Stuart had his own computer. His computer was, I don't know. For those of you that are into old computers or who have been into computers since back in the day, you had like the IBM PC, like not the PC Junior or any of those little things, but the original like IBM PC, like the 5150 and all of its little derivatives that had this desktop case that was like the size of a battleship. And it had that big red rocker switch on the side that when you flipped it, like it felt like you were flipping one of the switches in like the breaker box, on your house. Like it had like this, like it was hard to throw. It was like thunk, and then like slowly you would hear the fans like spinning up in the computer, like a jet engine. He had one of those, but it wasn't an IBM computer. I think a lot of companies ended up making clones of that case. And so he had one of those. And then he had an amber monochrome monitor. And so I go over to his house, and he just starts showing me some basic things of like, here's how to use your computer. Like, here's like some basic DOS commands. And I think he even showed me a little bit of how to use BASIC, which, speaking of which, so I wanted to start recording this episode this morning, but right here is a big window that I kind of use. Like, I have my little video lights here, but then having the window open provides a lot of extra light just for the room. But in the morning, the sun is kind of like over here, and so it was going to be shining like on me, which doesn't work when you're trying to record something like this. So to kill time, there was like a box of thrift store stuff down in the laundry room that my wife was kind of after me to take to the thrift store, and I figured, well, I can go do that, and I'll go grab a burger at In-N-Out, and then by the time I come back, it's like like now the light now is nice in here. And so I go and I drop off this box at the Goodwill, and like I don't, I've bitched and moaned, tons of times about how you can't really find anything good at the thrift stores anymore, and like I don't even really bother going, which is true. Most of the times now, if I go to the thrift store, it's because I'm already there dropping something off. And so I go into the Goodwill, and it's a total. For some reason, the Goodwill here where I live is always like packed. Like the parking lot's always full. There's always a bunch of people in there. And but today's a holiday, and every holiday that Goodwill is open, they have a 50% off sale. So for that reason, it was like extra packed. But I don't ever get to go in there, so I just walked around briefly, and I'm just kind of like I know all the spots. There's like the case where the video games are going to be. There's all the shelves with the electronics, and then I usually do a pass through where like the office supplies are, because sometimes you find cool old computer stuff in the office supplies. And then I usually just go like do a quick drive-by of the bookshelves. And what should I find on the bookshelf today? And this is the only thing that I picked up today, was this book, Basic Computer Games, Microcomputer Edition. And I just thought that was like one of the most appropriate things that I could have found today. Because like I said, I already knew I was recording this episode. I was just waiting for the sun to move so that I could record it. I actually already have this book, but this is a nicer copy. This copy looks like it's in practically new condition. And I got it for $1 because it was half off day. And what this book is I mean, kind of like it sounds. And I guess anybody that bought like a computer magazine back in the day will know what I'm talking about. Where later on you'd buy computer magazines and maybe it would come with a floppy disk, or if you bought like a PC Gamer magazine in like the late 90s or after, it would come with a CD-ROM that you could put in your system. But back in the old days, you'd get an issue of like Compute or something, and the way they would share software with you was by listing out basic programs in the magazine. And so you would have to sit there and enter in those programs into your computer, and then you could save it to a disk or save it to tape, or if you didn't have some media to save it to, you just didn't get to save it at all. And so that's what this is it's just nothing but a bunch of lists of all of these basic programs. Pretty simple ones. Like there's Hangman. Like, who didn't play Hangman, when it was like raining outside in elementary school and you had to stay inside? You'd play Hangman with whoever sat in the desk next to you. But yeah, so that's what this whole book is full of, is all these basic programs. And it's kind of interesting because there are many different versions of BASIC, and they're all slightly different. So even though all these listings are in here, they still kind of require a working knowledge of BASIC, because you are going to have to sort of make minor corrections in order to get these to run on your system. And it even says here, it's got a little page here on conversions to other basics. And then over here, it's actually got a little handy guide with some basic commands. So yes, that's pretty cool. So you might enter one of these programs and have it not work. But BASIC was always cool about the fact that it would tell you, like syntax error in line 540 or something, and then you could fix whatever the problem is, or figure it out. But anyway, I just thought this was a really cool find, and it even says in here, copyright 1978. Anyway, so so this had a cover price of $7.95, but I got it for $1, and this will replace my old copy, which, like I said, was not in as good of condition as the second. I got my old copy in a thrift store too, so I wonder, maybe this book was just super common back in the day. I don't really know. But anyway, Stuart and I became friends because of the whole computer thing, because he already had a computer, and and he could show me how to use a computer. So I'm over at Stuart's house, and I remember thinking, I think I might have even asked him, like, oh, what games do you have, And so, like I said, he has this, pretty big, it was like an office, a standard office desk. That's probably how they got it. It was probably some kind of surplus thing. And if you remember, those office desks would always have one drawer that was sort of like a file drawer. You know, like you could put folders in it, so it was a deep drawer. And he opens this drawer, and the entire drawer is full of boxed computer games. And but what they had in common is that they were all Sierra games. And I was just thinking like, wow, how'd you get all those? And he said, my dad works at Sierra, this company Sierra. Now, I'd never heard of Sierra. Like, to me, it was just like, okay, you know, what's Sierra? But, you know, I could see that all of the games were like, you know, this quest and that quest and the other quest. And they all had the same logo on the spine, which, you know, like I have here. You know, they all say, I mean, the boxes all look very similar, right? You can, is it going to focus if I hide? You know, it says Sierra there. And he said, yeah, my dad works there. He's a programmer. He works at Sierra. And I was just thinking like, wow, well, that's really cool. Like I said, I didn't know who Sierra really was. So to me, it was just like, all right, well, that's cool, I suppose. And it's only looking back on it later that I realized like, wow, how cool is that? And so basically what the deal was, you know, I'm not going to go into a whole history of Sierra or something, but although actually, can I reach it from here? Yeah. So if I can make a book recommendation, this is one of my all-time favorite books, is this book, Hackers. Hackers, Heroes of the Computer Revolution by Stephen Levy. It's not about what you might think it's about. It's not about hacking, like, you know, people who maliciously hack. It's about, I guess hackers used to be a term for people who programmed computers. Because that's what this is really about, is like the history of computer programming, which makes it sound boring, but I assure you that it's anything but. And there's a whole section. I actually reviewed this book on my website. If you go to cgquarterly.com, I think it's called CGQ Book Club or something like that. And I reviewed this book just because I love it so much. And the final, I don't know, third of the book is really about the history of Sierra. So it's part 3, Game Hackers. And yeah, it says the Sierras in the 80s. And the first chapter is called The Wizard and the Princess, because that I think was the first, I think that was the first game they ever made. It was either that or Mystery House. I don't remember. But the whole point is, so this entire section of the book is about basically the history of Sierra Online, from when it started up until this book came out, which was like 1984. So really, I think when I read this book for the first time, which was in the late 90s, is when I really gained even a greater appreciation for the fact that my best friend's dad was a game programmer. And in fact, he even has his name in the manual of one of these King's Quest games. So that's pretty cool. You know, by this time I'd played games like Shadowgate and, you know, obviously Legend of Zelda. So it's not like, you know, these weren't like groundbreaking in that way. But what was really cool, I think the first one I ever played is probably Police Quest. In Pursuit of the Death Angel. Ooh. What was cool about these was the fact that you could type in commands. And it had like a language parser in it, which is, you know, not something that I ever saw on the Nintendo, that's for sure. You know, aside from learning how to program in BASIC and messing around with other programs, like I remember Stuart gave me this program called Tran, which I have. I had to ask on the Vintage Computer forums. Somebody came up with a copy of Tran for me, and I don't know if that's short for translate or what that's short for, but it was this program where you could type in a sentence, and it was a text-to-speech program that just used the PC speaker. Because of course, at this time I didn't have a sound card. I mean, this computer that I had, no color graphics, no sound card, and no mouse, and no joystick. So it was just, you know, me with the keyboard. And you know, probably not too long after I got a mouse, just because, you know, you'd go to one of these like mom and pop computer stores like the one that I talked about in the Radio Shack episode. You know, they popped up. You had like bigger computer stores, like there was Computer Land, but you also had these mom and pop computer shops that cropped up in the 80s, and you could go in there and buy some like no name mouse for, you know, 10 or 15 bucks. And so I ended up getting one of those. That was probably the first thing I bought, you know, accessory wise, or upgrade, if you want to call it that, was I ended up getting a mouse. But you know, I'm trying to think of like what games I would have played when I still just had the monochrome set up. And for sure, these games were part of it, because, you know, Stuart would just let me borrow one or something. I could take it home and work on it. I said I didn't want to go into the whole history of Sierra, but so Sierra, sort of at its peak, you know, during this time, was located in Oakhurst, California, which wasn't too far from where I lived. Like from where I lived, if you wanted to go to Yosemite, you would pass through Oakhurst. It was like it's like a little town in the foothills. And it's the kind of place where if you were driving to Yosemite, you'd stop in Oakhurst because you needed gas or because you wanted to have lunch. And so like in Oakhurst is where they had their offices and everything. And as a result, for the longest time, anytime I was in Oakhurst, I would go to all the thrift stores. And for some reason, for the size Oakhurst is, there at least used to be quite a few thrift stores. And for just being a small mountain town, I would find a disproportionate amount of old computer stuff, like old computers. Like I got an Apple IIc Plus one time at a thrift store up there, which is one of the harder to find iterations of the Apple II, and one that's more sought after. And I also used to find that's where I got a lot of my Sierra games, is you would just go into some thrift store and it would just be sitting on the shelf. And this isn't all of my Sierra games. These are just sort of the more noteworthy ones. I have the Colonel's Bequest. I left that one on the shelf. And I left one of the Leisure Suit Larrys on there. But like I said, I started off with Police Quest, but then I remember he also had Space Quest. Now, I don't have Space Quest #1. The only Space Quest I have is Space Quest #2 here, which is pretty cool. It still has, well, there's what the box looks like. It still has the price tag on it, $49.99. It doesn't say where the price tag is from, so I don't really know. But some cool box art, though. Anyway, I remember playing either Space Quest 1 or Space Quest 2 at Stuart's house. And he had the King's Quest games. I don't remember being quite as into the King's Quest games. The other game that we were really into, that, I mean, who doesn't love Leisure Suit Larry? And this was a game, I picked this game up at a thrift store not in Oakhurst. And I think this game cost me like $1. And, you know, all these games, it was just like a slipcover that it would have. And then all the games came in this same box that just has the Sierra logo and then this picture of Half Dome up in Yosemite on it. You know, Sierra made other games, but really their adventure games were their bread and butter. And but anyway, like I said, I used to find a lot of these in thrift stores. And then the other thing, a couple other things that I found, and I only mention these because I showed this mug a long time ago on Flashback, and I said I was going to talk about it someday, but that, you know, that was going to be a long ways off. But that's today, so we're here. And this is a mug that I found at a thrift store in Oakhurst, and you can see that it says Sierra Japan on it, and it has the Sierra logo, the way it sort of appeared in games. And then on the back, it says, presumably the same thing, but in Japanese, and I don't know if that's kanji or, I mean, I don't speak Japanese, but anyway, I can only assume what I think this is from is at some point Sierra started working with this Japanese company to localize their games here in the U.S. And the only example I can think of off the top of my head is Thexter. I don't know if anybody out there remembers the game Thexter. It was a side-scrolling action game where you were like this robot who could transform in between being a robot and being like a jet fighter. I mean, it was a pretty cool game. I just remember Stuart had Thexter, and we played that one a little bit, but not really. But I'm guessing that that's what this mug is all about. And then the other one I have here is, I mean, this is not nearly as cool, but Front Page Sports Football. But if you can see down there, it says Dynamics, because Dynamics was like a subsidiary of Sierra. I'm guessing it used to be its own company and that Sierra bought them. But the main reason I remember Dynamics is that another game that Stuart had was the Red Baron, and which is like a World War One. I don't know if you can really call that a flight simulator, but like air combat game. You know, like I talked about Warbirds when I was showing off my Lynx, Atari Lynx stuff, and you know, Red Baron would be like a PC version of that. In fact, I think I even mentioned the Red Baron in that episode. But that was a Dynamics game, so when you started that game up, you got the Dynamics logo instead of the Sierra logo. And I mean, but I would have bought this no matter. I mean, it's a Sierra mug, so why would I not buy that? But anyway, so that's kind of my whole thing with Sierra. That's why, you know, I would say that, you know, maybe not my absolute favorite DOS PC game developer, but certainly top three. I mean, it's got to be like LucasArts, them, and I mean, I don't even know who else. I mean, those are. I feel like Sierra and LucasArts are like the top two by a country mile. But you know, like I know Metal Jesus. One of the things that he's sort of well known for is that he used to work for Sierra, but that was after Sierra moved to Washington because they got bought out by, I don't know who, Vivendi or somebody. But this was back in the old days when I'm not trying to throw shade. I'm just saying, like, this is when it was really Sierra Online, not after it got turned into some other you know, mutant thing. I have a harder time coming up with memories of playing games when I just had the monochrome setup. Like I remember we played a game called Scorched Earth that my friend Eric was just tweeting about the other day. Scorched Earth was like this tank combat game where you would set the angle and power or whatever intensity of your shot, and you had to try to arc these shots like to the other side of the screen and hit your opponents, right? So you'd shoot and then you'd miss, and so you go, okay, I need to like add more power, or take some power away, and try again. Like, you know, there was the series Worms that came out later that was really just the same thing as Scorched Earth. And I feel like Macintosh computers had their own game that was similar. I'm not trying to say that the guy that developed Scorched Earth like invented that style of gameplay. I don't really know what the history is of that, but we used to play a lot of Scorched Earth, and because I think you could play that game in monochrome, although we kept playing it when we got color monitors. But one thing I remember about Scorched Earth, and I don't know, would it be fun to play Scorched Earth on a live stream? I don't know, maybe for a few minutes. But one thing that I remember that we had a lot of fun with that game was anytime you would shoot, your tank would like say something. It would just be in text, but a little text line would show up, and it was, you know, it was saying some kind of gung ho, you know, like say hello to my little friend or something like that. And then when a tank got hit and got killed, they would say something, you know, like some kind of little goodbye message. And Stuart and I figured out which files had those in them. And, you know, like the extension of the file was something that you would never think was a text file, but it actually was just a text file. So you could open it in like any text editor, and you could change what the tank said. And so we, you know, being, you know, young teenage guys or young teenage boys, we, you know, changed all of the sayings to things that were filthy. And I still have those, actually, because, you know, I still have not my original hard drive, but the second hard drive I ever got. I still have it. And all the data is still on there. It's intact. I've backed it up. I think I have a copy of it all on this computer too. But yeah, anyway, I don't know if that would be a fun game to play on a live stream or something. But it definitely would be fun to play, I think, one of these Sierra adventure games on a live stream. And actually, you know, a game that you don't really hear people talk about that much, as, you know, part of the Sierra adventure series is Gold Rush. And like, I didn't even know about Gold Rush back then. Stuart didn't have this game. This is a game that I found once again at a thrift store in Oakhurst, and I had never heard of it, but, you know, I grabbed it because I thought, well, hey, that looks pretty cool. And I have to say, I actually think this is my favorite Sierra adventure game. So that might be a fun game actually to do on a live stream. Now, the next live stream is not going to be doing DOS games, but I do want to start streaming DOS games. And in fact, the whole reason that I got excited about doing this episode is, like I said, because I set up some DOS games on my computer downstairs. And while I was doing that, I was kind of messing around with OBS and seeing how that was going to work if I wanted to stream games that I was playing on that computer. So yeah, like I said, in those early days with the monochrome monitor, I only remember a few games. Not too long after getting the computer, like within the first year, I got my first major upgrade to the computer, which was an upgrade in a couple of big ways. And as much as I would love to just start talking about that right now, that obviously is going to be a topic for the next episode of Flashback. So, I don't know how entertaining this particular episode was, but, I needed to kind of get the stage set for talking about PC games, because that is going to be something we're going to be talking about for a pretty good handful of Flashback episodes. Now, I did get a Sega Genesis, so and that, I had that system while I had my PC, but to be sure, between the years of about 1990 and 1993 or 1994, the PC was really my primary gaming platform, with the Genesis probably being in second place. And I still had my Nintendo, and I did still actually buy a few Nintendo games. I became a real Nintendo game bargain hunter. And if I would see a game for sale, say in like the previously played bin at a video store, or in the clearance bin at KB, I still picked those games up. But Stuart and I actually both got Genesis systems right about at the same time. So if you're not super into the PC, although I think you should be, we're going to be looking at a lot of really cool games. Some of the games that, in my opinion, made the DOS PC the best gaming platform to have, back in the early 90s. It really was very different than having a console. They were very complementary platforms if you were lucky enough to have both, like I was. Because generally speaking, games that came out for the console systems, whether it was Nintendo or Genesis or whatever, that also came out on PC, were actually not as good on the PC. Like there was a version of Mega Man that came out for the IBM PC. I don't remember in what year. It's terrible. Or one of my favorite games that we already did a live stream of was Buck Rogers' Countdown to Doomsday. And the PC version of that is not bad, but in the early 90s, most computer games did not have support for a sound card, and sound was a real weak point of IBM PC clones. Like if you had a Commodore or an Amiga, in the late 80s and early 90s, you could definitely make the case that that was the better platform to have for gaming. But once Sound Blaster compatibility became standard with games, and VGA graphics became standard with games, there really wasn't anything that was going to touch having like a 386 or a 486 PC system. That being the case, games like Sonic the Hedgehog or Streets of Rage, these marquee games for the Genesis, or Super Mario World and Legend of Zelda: Link to the Past, like things that were the marquee games for the Super Nintendo, you weren't getting those games on the PC. And so that's why I say they really were complementary platforms, because if you wanted to experience everything that the gaming landscape had to offer, you really had to have both. I didn't have a Super Nintendo, so I didn't get to play those games, but I'm very thankful that I had both a PC and the Genesis, so that I got to play both. So anyway, that's going to do it for this episode of Flashback. Next time on Flashback, as I said, we're going to talk about some pretty major upgrades that were made to my PC, and then that way we can start talking about some of these games that used color graphics. And the game we're going to talk about next time is probably one of the most famous games from the early PC days, color PC days. And after that, I eventually got a sound card, and then we're going to be off and running with, like I said, just some awesome games, many of which would populate, if I were to make a top 10 list of my all-time favorite video games, a number of them would be games that we're going to be talking about in just the next few episodes of Flashback. So that's going to do it for this episode. As always, thanks to all of you guys for watching. I'll see you guys next time.